That was Donna Diamond reporting on the many questions raised by Noam Chomsky in his life's work. Well, we got a chance to address some of the issues raised there with Chomsky himself. He's in Ireland as the guest of Amnesty International. This morning we sat down with him for the only television interview of his visit. Your visit comes at a time when there's great debate in Ireland about our role in the war in Iraq, the situation there right now. Last night you were asked about the Irish government's decision to allow US planes and forces to stop at Shannon. You said, if this is true, this is participation in what Nuremberg called a supreme international crime. Are you saying that the Irish government are guilty of war crimes?
Well, if I quoted at the Nuremberg trial Justice Jackson, the chief counsel, who was very eloquent about the fact that the crimes we are now, for which we are now sentencing the present accused, are general crimes. If we are ever guilty of them, we must be subjected to the same judgment. And he was very clear and properly eloquent about that.
But it's not that far from the next step, which is that Bertie Ahern, on that basis, is a war criminal.
That's for you to decide. If you participate, this
was your opinion.
Well, my opinion is that of the Nuremberg Tribunal, that invasion of another country is, in their words, the supreme international crime, which encompasses within it all of the evil that follows.
Well, my question is, if a person allows those forces to travel through our country, our jurisdiction, the Taoiseach...
Well, it's participation. You have to decide to what extent participation...
Does that make the person, the Taoiseach, who approves that decision, a war criminal?
Well, ask yourself the same question. Take the time when the Russians were invading Afghanistan.
Your conclusion, knowing what you know at this stage.
Just consider the analogy. Suppose the Russians, take the 80s when the Russians were invading Afghanistan. Geography isn't right, but suppose that they had been sending their military forces through Shannon to land there and then go on to invade Afghanistan. Would that have been participation in the invasion of Afghanistan?
Do you think you can make the conclusion yourself? Can you tell us what you think?
Yes, it's not even my conclusion. It's just like 2 and 2 equals 4.
It's
participation.
Is a war criminal.
Well, what is exactly a war criminal is an open question.
Well, that's what I'm asking.
It is participation in a major crime.
You quote Nuremberg, obviously this definition given there, but the Irish government quote the UN resolution passed again last November, which says that all countries should support the Iraqi people in their pursuit of peace, stability, security, democracy and prosperity, and say the use of Shannon by the US is part of that effort.
Well, that's up to the Iraqi people, of whom the vast majority want the occupation forces to leave. The British Defense Ministry just carried out a poll which was leaked to the British press, which found 82% want the occupation forces either leave immediately or as soon as the government's formed. 1% think that they're improving security.
But the government has to look to international law, clearly.
And
it's looking to this UN resolution.
The UN resolution says nothing about the legitimacy of the war. It said exactly what you said.
It call on
the
international community to support stability, peace, security, democracy and prosperity.
And security, peace, democracy and prosperity doesn't mean fighting a war. It means observing the will of the victims.
But the issue here is whether or not the Irish government is right to allow US troops going, we're assuming, to try and create security in Iraq.
No, that's what you're assuming. But that's like saying the Russians were trying to secure security and peace in Afghanistan, which indeed they were. But that didn't mean that one should abet a war crime.
Can I ask about this issue of rendition, which is the transport of prisoners as part of sort of a secret network within the war on terror by the Americans? There are many flights, scores of flights that have landed in Irish airports, which were linked to this rendition program in one way or the other. The American government says emphatically no prisoners were on those flights. It would be an amazingly open, egregious lie from one ally to another, wouldn't it, if they were actually transporting prisoners? Do you think they're capable of that lie?
I mean, is there any question of it? And of course, governments lie all the time. This government has lied repeatedly and continues to. And it really doesn't matter whether there are prisoners on it. Suppose the planes are refueled at Shannon and then carry prisoners for what's called rendition. Rendition is just a fancy word which means torture. Okay, so suppose that planes are landing, being refueled, then being sent on to abet torture. well, then the Irish people have to ask themselves, do we want to participate in torture?
The only moral course now is to stop these planes even landing at Shannon.
Look, anything involved in rendition is such a grotesque crime that even touching it at a distance is shameful.
You could come away from your work, reading it, and say to yourself, there is no other source of suffering and evil in the world but the government of the United States.
No, one couldn't come away with that, because what I constantly say is exactly what I said here. The United States is acting in the way power systems act. There have been many others in history. The United States happens to be in a unique position of overwhelming power, and it acts the way other powerful states do.
But you have withering words for the U.S., and many people would agree with you, but when you trace a line on the map, let's say from North Korea to China to Burma to Iran to Syria to Zimbabwe, you don't hear a lot of withering words for the people there in those countries that are denying human rights.
Oh, that's not true. I mean, for example, just take my dealings with Amnesty International. They include, for example, giving a televised interview in London about prisoners in Syria. I've condemned crimes in Algeria, especially France's involvement in them currently, and in fact throughout the world. In fact, I was so hated by the Kremlin that they literally killed my entire professional field. I wasn't allowed in Eastern Europe, but my entire professional field was killed for about 30 years because of its association with me. They know who their enemies are. Here, people pretend they don't.
Is there ever a value or a case or a situation that requires military intervention by one country in the affairs of another?
Yes, there are, and there are mechanisms for it. The United Nations Charter provides mechanisms for it.
There is a quote I read from 1999 where it seems you say that a standard argument is that we had to do something. We could not stand by as atrocities continue. That's never true. One choice always is to follow the Hippocratic principle, first do no harm. If you can think of no way to adhere to that principle, then do nothing.
Well, that's trivial. I mean, just as it is for a doctor, which is what it was for. If the only thing you can think of is harming the patient, then you do nothing.
But let's take a case, and a very distressing case, in Rwanda. People knew that there was about to be a massacre. It was in progress. Hutu militiamen murdered 800,000 people. Do nothing? Because there certainly would have been a military intervention would have had to involve the killing of people.
You didn't follow the logic of it. If intervening in Rwanda would have caused harm, then it's better not to do it. If intervening in Rwanda would have been helpful, then yes, you do it. But it's just trivial.
If you did intervening, there would have had to be many people killed to save the greater good.
But the question is the balance of effect. Same with a doctor. If a doctor gives you an inoculation, it's going to hurt. Okay, but that's not what the Hippocratic Oath doesn't say. Don't give an inoculation. It says if what you're going to do is going to cause harm, more harm than good, then don't do it.
But that's the crucial thing, more harm than good.
But that's exactly what the Hippocratic Oath is, and it's exactly what I quoted. If the only thing you can think of doing is making things worse, then don't do it.
So essentially what you're saying is that sometimes the morally reprehensible wrong thing is not to intervene militarily sometimes.
If military intervention would be beneficial, yes, of course. And it was, in the case of Rwanda, it's not clear that military intervention was needed. A small military force might very well have prevented these events. Incidentally, we like to look at it in 1994, but I was writing about that in 1979.
There's an issue in Kosovo, a very interesting, illuminating chapter. I want to ask you about that because the conventional wisdom is that there was, in prospect, developing, possibly genocide, certainly ethnic cleansing, certainly atrocities, certainly massacres happening. The NATO bombed and the Serbs stopped their campaign against the Albanians. You say the crimes only happened after.
Sorry, you're right. That is the conventional story, and it's a total fabrication. We have immense evidence about this. 2 huge State Department compilations of documents trying to justify the bombing. A British parliamentary inquiry which went into it.
You say the crimes only happened after the bombing?
I don't say. They say. The overwhelming evidence, documentation up to the sky, all says the same thing.
And you say that's the fact?
Well, since that's the entire Western documentation,
But it's not the entire Western documentation.
Yes,
for example, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe went back, did a verification of what actually happened. Its conclusion was that the Serb campaign against the Albanians was a well-rehearsed strategy. Their intent to apply mass killing as an instrument of terror, coercion, or punishment against Kosovo Albanians was already in evidence in 1998, the year before the bombing.
They didn't say that. What they said is they said they had contingency plans to carry out atrocities if they were under attack.
If you look at the newspapers from the time, clearly, people like Mary Robinson, who was our former Irish president, were saying there were massacres, there needed to be an investigation, there needed to be action. This was before the bombing.
What we know what she was saying, and we have the OSCE record, entire record, thick record. What it says is Kosovo is an ugly place. There were
more than that. There was evidence of killing in progress and of a campaign.
And I'll tell you how much there was from the British government, the American government, the OSCE, the KVM monitors, and so on. They said in the preceding year there were about 2,000 people killed. According to the British government, most of them killed by KLA guerrillas. There were no changes up until the withdrawal of the monitors by the West. Then came the bombing. The bombing led to massive atrocities, which were anticipated.
The last night, you used certain examples. They were statements slightly overdrawn. Critics will say...
Purposely, but not this one.
Well, critics will say that you tend, sometimes, to search for the facts that suit your thesis and tend to exclude the facts.
You can say that if you can give an example, I'll be glad to listen. Well, but in this case...
I don't know, because I'm not a mind reader, but is that something that you feel you do sometimes?
If I say so. Last night what I said is, here I'm saying a strong statement, purposely overdrawn, because I want you to challenge it, to question it. What I'm saying now is not over.
Facts matter.
But I made it clear that I'm slightly overdrawing this so that you will challenge it, and you'll find that it's basically correct. In this case, I am simply reviewing the conclusions of the U.S. State Department, the British Parliamentary Inquiry, the OSCE, KVM monitors. If you want the details, look at what I've written about it. It goes all through it.
It's often in your work. Yeah. Slightly overdrawn.
No, you're mistaking. Last night I said once, I am now making a statement which is going to be slightly overdrawn because I want you to challenge it. So I'm asking you to challenge it. If you challenge it, you'll find it's essentially correct, and it's a crucial conclusion. I'm not saying that in this case. I'm saying I am precisely reviewing the conclusions of the State Department, the British Parliamentary Inquiry, the OSCE, KVM monitors, NATO, all led to the same conclusions.
Your critics will say that there is never any real midpoint in the way you characterize people, places, or issues, that there's always a villain or a hero, there's always a democrat or a tyrant. Is there a middle ground in world politics?
Yes, and that's exactly what I talk about all the time. I mean, people who don't like to hear the facts and don't like the conclusions have a reflexive response. You're always blaming America, you're doing this. That's just evasion of the facts.
But some people say, it's not all black and white, there's gray, there's nuance in this.
Yes, that's what I say all the time. Yes, everything's gray. The Russian invasion of Afghanistan was gray. The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor was gray. Everything's gray. But nevertheless, we draw conclusions. And we specifically ought to draw the conclusions about ourselves. When we're involved in criminal acts, even though there are always shades of gray, we should face it, not suppress it. Kosovo's a case in point.
These days, something different's happened. I mean, last night, for example, people queuing to get into your lecture, your books fly off the shelves. In many ways, dissent has entered the mainstream, very certainly in Western Europe, hasn't it?
No, quite the contrary. It's exactly like as in the United States. I mean, if I give a talk in central Illinois, Idaho border, or whatever it may be, thousands of people will come. Will it be in the mainstream media? No.
But there's still no danger of Noam Chomsky becoming the mainstream?
I wouldn't call it a danger. I'd be happy to be mainstream. But powerful institutions do not enjoy being criticized. There's nothing surprising about that. I mean, in the United States or in Western Europe, a very high degree of freedom has been won, not granted, won. And that means that you're relatively free from the kind of repression that takes place in most of the world. But you are not going to be welcomed by those whose power you're trying to undermine.
Finally, there is a danger, isn't there, that Noam Chomsky becomes almost what they call a Rorschach test, I think, in psychology, whereby it means something visceral to both sides of people, that your ideas get lost in this very loud and very bitter debate about, quotes and things. Do you ever fear that possibly in that din...
It just happened in the last half hour when you repeated what indeed is said, that I never see any shades of gray, I always blame America, and so on. Those are natural defensive reactions on the part of people who do not want to hear the truth about themselves. Yes, of course that happens.
And that was Noam Chomsky speaking to us earlier.